On the ancient bronze mirror's surface, ripples began to spread, and the deep, mysterious dark hue gradually faded away like receding tides. The blurred image started to emerge, flickering in and out of view. Chen and Nine Nether both focused their attention on it. Inside the massive bronze mirror, what appeared was an endless, sprawling continent. Mountains stretched out, seemingly without end. The perspective was from an extremely high altitude, as though looking down from the heavens, and that viewpoint kept rising higher. Chen stared at the unfamiliar continent, utterly confused. He had no idea where this place was. On the other side, Nine Nether studied the mountains and terrain carefully, her brows furrowed as if she was deep in thought. The image continued to unfold, eventually forming a map of the continent. This land exuded an indescribable vastness that left one in awe. Chen stared at the unfamiliar terrain map, eventually letting out a bitter smile. The great thousand worlds were too vast, with countless continents. Trying to pinpoint this place based on just this map was no easy task. Moreover, the Mirror of Judgment hadn't given them the exact location of the Page of Immortality. Was it expecting them to wander blindly across such a vast continent, like headless chickens? The odds of success were probably incredibly low. Just as Chen sighed helplessly, a new light began to gather on the Mirror of Judgment. Faintly, it seemed to transform into an ancient palace. Above the palace, the sun and moon hung suspended, their light casting a radiant glow over the vast continent. Nine Nether's beautiful eyes locked onto the ancient palace and the floating sun and moon above it. Her body shuddered slightly, and her gaze filled with profound astonishment. The image did not last long before slowly fading. Soon, the mirror's surface darkened again, and the light that had enveloped the Page of Immortality dissipated. Chen reached out, and the Page of Immortality returned to his hand, which he swiftly stored within his body. I have no clue, Chen sighed. Whether it was the unfamiliar continent or the ancient palace, he had no leads. Not necessarily. Nine Nether, who had been staring at the Mirror of Judgment, suddenly smiled. Chen was taken aback by her sudden shift in expression. A surge of excitement filled his heart. Did Nine Nether discover something? If I'm not mistaken, the continent that appeared in the Mirror of Judgment should be Tianluo Continent, one of the 10 supercontinents in the Great Thousand Worlds, Nine Nether said with a smile. One of the 10 supercontinents. Tianluo Continent. Chen murmured. The most famous regions in the Great Thousand Worlds are the 10 supercontinents. They form the core area of the entire Great Thousand Worlds, teeming with prosperity and populated by experts as numerous as the stars. The continent where your Northern Heaven Spiritual Academy is located, Xun'er Continent, is nothing compared to Tianluo Continent. In fact, any top-tier force there would be on par with your Northern Heaven Spiritual Academy. Chen couldn't help but click his tongue. While he knew that Xun'er Continent wasn't very significant in the Great Thousand Worlds, he hadn't expected it to be so insignificant. After all, Northern Heaven Spiritual Academy was essentially the dominant force on Xun'er Continent. But compared to these supercontinents, it seemed relatively weak. You seem to know quite a bit about Tianluo Continent, Chen said, surprised. He noticed that Nine Nether seemed very familiar with it. Do you know where I came from before my tribulation failed? Nine Nether asked with a sly smile. Chen stared at her, bewildered. Could it be Tianluo Continent? Correct. Nine Nether nodded seriously. Is the Nine Nether Sparrow clan also from Tianluo Continent? Chen asked in shock. The Nine Nether Sparrow clan isn't from Tianluo Continent, but I went there for some training. And I actually have my own territory there, Nine Nether said with a proud smile, her lips curling slightly. You even built a force? Chen was truly astonished. I didn't build a force. I was introduced to a top-tier force by an elder. After all, when you're out in the world, you can't go around with no backing, especially in a place like Tianluo Continent where there are so many hidden experts. Nine Nether shook her head. Oh, there's a force that could make you lower your status. At that time, I hadn't evolved successfully yet, and I didn't even have supreme-level strength. With such power, it was simply not enough to make a mark in the Tianluo Continent. The faction I was part of was called Great Luo Heaven Domain. But don't underestimate it. This is one of the top-tier factions in the Tianluo Continent. Its overall strength is likely stronger than, or at least on par with, the Northern Heaven Spiritual Academy. And within the Great Luo Heaven domain, I was also part of the upper echelons. Nine Nether chuckled softly. You didn't even have supreme level strength back then, and you still became part of the upper echelons? Mu Chen asked, his voice filled with doubt. Haha, who told you my backer is powerful? Nine Nether's lips curled in an even more obvious smug grin. Mu Chen shook his head helplessly. So this so-called upper echelon was only due to pulling strings. He then turned his gaze towards the Mirror of Judgment and asked, if what appeared in the Mirror of Judgment earlier was indeed the Tianluo Continent, then what does the shape of the palace with the sun and moon represent? Nine Nether's eyebrows furrowed slightly. She pondered for a long while before slowly answering, I once heard a rumor in the Tianluo Continent. It said that hidden there is an ancient heavenly palace, and its master was a super existence in ancient times, someone who could shake the heavens and the earth. Even a heavenly supreme would find it hard to contend with such a being. Mu Chen's expression changed slightly. Even a heavenly supreme couldn't contend with this entity? How terrifying could it be? It's rumored that within that heavenly palace, there are divine items that would even tempt Earth supremes and heavenly supremes. However, all these years, no one seems to have truly seen this ancient heavenly palace, so it remains just a rumor. A contemplative look appeared in Nine Nether's beautiful eyes. She spoke softly. If the immortal tome really lies within that ancient heavenly palace, then I suspect that this super existence could very well be one of the 10 powerful beings from the ancient era who controlled the primordial law body. In fact, it's highly likely that this being was the first to control the eternal undying body. Mu Chen's expression grew serious. Nine Nether's analysis made sense. Perhaps the immortal tome was indeed connected to the ancient heavenly palace. However, he was also starting to feel a headache. Setting aside whether the ancient heavenly palace even existed, even if it did appear, it would surely cause a massive uproar. The idea of seizing the immortal tome amidst countless powerful figures was essentially like snatching food from a tiger's mouth. It would be incredibly dangerous. However, no matter what, he had finally gathered some clues and wasn't going to give up easily. It looks like we now have a goal, Mu Chen said softly. Going to the Tianluo Continent. That does sound like a good place for training, Nine Nether chuckled. My current goal is simply to grow stronger, strong enough to protect those I want to protect. And the Tianluo Continent is one of the supercontinents. I imagine it will be far more exciting and perilous than the Northern Song Continent, Mu Chen said with a slight smile. The Tianluo Continent clearly seemed like a great place, and he could use the opportunity to gather information about the ancient heavenly palace. That way, if the chance arose, he could act first. Of course, before that, he still needed to increase his strength. Without the proper power, even if the ancient heavenly palace appeared, he wouldn't have the qualifications to seize anything. I never thought I'd return to the Tianluo Continent. It's a bit nostalgic, Nine Nether said with a hint of emotion. When she left the Nine Nether Sparrow clan, she had gone straight to the Tianluo Continent. Later, due to tribulation-related reasons, she ended up wandering around, eventually landing in the small northern spirit realm. By chance, she ended up forming a bloodline bond with Mu Chen. And most ironically, now Mu Chen needed to go to that supercontinent as well. Fate really was unpredictable. Let's go then. Once we're in the Tianluo Continent, I'll be relying on you, the local expert, Mu Chen smiled. As long as you mention my name, I'll ensure you dominate the Tianluo Continent, Nine Nether said with a grin. Mu Chen rolled his eyes and ignored her. Even though the Great Luo Heaven domain, where Nine Nether was from, was one of the top factions in the Tianluo Continent, it was still just one of the many forces there. And even if Nine Nether was part of its upper echelons, there was no way she could be running rampant across the entire Tianluo Continent. Mu Chen turned and leaped down the long stone steps, heading toward the spatial rift. Although he hadn't gathered the most precise information this time, the results were still satisfying. The two of them emerged from the spatial rift, and with a ripple of spatial fluctuation, they appeared before the main hall of the Northern Heaven Spiritual Academy. In front of them, the North Abyss Dragon Koan was smiling as he watched them. Is everything settled? Mu Chen nodded, handing the bronze seal back to the North Abyss Dragon Koan, and sincerely said, Thank you, Senior Bei Ming. The North Abyss Dragon Cohen waved his sleeve, and the spatial rift slowly began to dissipate. He looked at the young man before him, his expression softening, and asked, "It should be soon, right?" 3 days from now. Mu Chun took a deep breath, suppressing the reluctance in his heart, and replied. The North Abyss Dragon Cohen gently nodded, and a smile appeared on his aged face. "I look forward to hearing news about you again. I believe that by then, you'll shock us all. You are the pride of our Northern Heaven Spiritual Academy. I don't want our genius to be overshadowed by the countless other talents in the great thousand worlds. I will do my best." Mu Chun also grinned, then turned to gaze at the vibrant and familiar spiritual academy. In the fading light of the setting sun, numerous figures flew across the sky, heading in all directions, scattering from the Northern Heaven Spiritual Academy. The Luo God Society, Thunder Domain, Spirit Gathering Array, Spirit Value Hall. One by one, the familiar places gradually faded from view as the twilight deepened. Mu Chun spread his arms, a smile playing at the corners of his lips. Though he was reluctant to leave, he looked forward to the road ahead. This was not the end, but merely the beginning of his journey. Goodbye, Northern Heaven Spiritual Academy. 3 days quickly passed by. As the first light of dawn broke through the darkness on the third day and illuminated the land, the Northern Heaven Spiritual Academy once again brimmed with vitality. But today, the atmosphere in the academy was somewhat different from usual. Countless students looked up, their gazes focused on the peak of the central mountain of the academy. There, a tall and slender figure could be faintly seen. All the students already knew that Mu Chun was about to leave the Northern Heaven Spiritual Academy. Their eyes were filled with admiration and respect as they gazed at the figure in the morning light. He was the brightest star in the academy, the one who had won glory for the Northern Heaven Spiritual Academy in the Spiritual Academy Grand Competition. Though young men often carried a sense of pride, they genuinely admired and revered Mu Chun from the bottom of their hearts. At the Luo God Society headquarters, thousands of members wore somber expressions. Mu Chun and Luo Li were practically the pillars of the society. Now that both of them were leaving, the blow to the Luo God Society was significant. However, they all understood that Mu Chun had outgrown the Northern Heaven Spiritual Academy. He needed a larger stage, and the academy was too small for him. Thus, while they were saddened, they fully understood his decision. In the training grounds, Yi Qingling, Yu Shi, and Su Linger all looked up. Yu Shi, the little girl, had red eyes, unable to hold back her tears when she heard the news of Mu Chun's departure. Now, though, she sniffled, her big eyes welling up with fresh tears. "All right, don't cry anymore." Yi Qingling gently patted her little head and smiled. "Mu Chun told us that when he leaves, you'll be the backbone of the Luo God Society. That's your responsibility, and you can't let him down." Yushi wiped her eyes, nodding firmly. "Don't worry, Yi sister, I won't let the Luo God Society fall. Next time, I'll definitely win the championship in the Spiritual Academy Grand Competition." "That's the spirit." Yi Qingling smiled gently, then raised her beautiful eyes, gazing at the figure. She whispered to herself, "Mu Chun, may the road ahead be smooth." At the peak of the mountain, Mu Chun lowered his gaze, looking at the vast Northern Heaven Spiritual Academy. The countless gazes from below were captured in his sight, and a sense of bittersweet farewell surged in his heart. Behind him, Ling Shi walked up, her cold, exquisite face softening into a gentle smile. She stood in front of Mu Chun, her jade hand gently smoothing his robe. "After leaving the Northern Heaven Spiritual Academy, be careful of everything." Mu Chun looked at her delicate, beautiful face up close, moved. He extended his arm, gently pulling her into a brief hug, then quickly released her. "Senior Ling Shi, you have to be careful too. If you encounter danger, just retreat for the time being." Ling Shi's delicate body stiffened slightly due to Mu Chun's actions. When she heard his words, her eyes reddened slightly, and a wave of gratitude filled her gaze. She could feel the concern embedded in Mu Chun's words. She nodded gently, then turned her beautiful eyes toward the 9 nether sparrow beside her, offering a faint smile. 9 nether, I was wrong for targeting you earlier. I hope you won't hold it against me." The 9 nether sparrow froze for a moment, clearly caught off guard by Ling Shi's proactive apology. It left her feeling a little flustered, and her face looked a bit unnatural. She waved her hand dismissively. It's fine. Then, from now on, please take good care of him. Ling, she said softly. The Nine Nether Sparrow nodded. My life is bound to his. I won't let anything happen to him. At this moment, the North Abyss Dragon Kuan and Grand Song Academy headmaster arrived. They looked at Mu Chen, smiling as they spoke. The teleportation spirit array has been completed. It will send you out of the North Song Continent. From there, you will need to find the large cities and other continents and use their teleportation spirit arrays to continue your journey. Thank you, Senior North Abyss and Headmaster. Mu Chen said as he gazed at the massive teleportation spirit array in the sky behind them. The Tianluo Continent was incredibly distant. Even a supreme powerhouse would need to rely on the teleportation spirit array to make the journey. Otherwise, they'd have to travel for half a year without rest, assuming no interruptions along the way. Between the various continents, vast oceans or treacherous natural barriers separated them. Some continents were even isolated by torrents of space energy, making passage perilous, even for supreme powerhouses. It's almost time, let's go. Mu Chen took a deep breath. Though reluctant, he didn't hesitate. He turned to the Nine Nether Sparrow and spoke. She nodded in response, and in the next instant, the two of them appeared inside the teleportation spirit array. Mu Chen, don't embarrass us from the North Song Spiritual Academy while you're out there. After all, you're considered the first of our academy. A voice rang out from not far away. It was Shun Songxing and Li Xiantong, floating in the air, watching them. Mu Chen, if we meet again, don't let us pull you down. Next time, we won't go easy on you, Li Xiantong said, a smile forming on his handsome face. Mu Chen nodded gently at the two of them. Brother Mu, safe travels. From the headquarters of the Luo God Society, countless voices rang out in unison. All the members of the society stood up and bowed respectfully in the direction where Mu Chen stood. This was their way of showing respect to the founder of the Luo God Society. Mu Chen watched this scene, his nose slightly tinged with the warmth of emotion. However, he didn't say anything further and instead turned his gaze toward the North Abyss Dragon Kuan, nodding slightly. The North Abyss Dragon Kuan nodded back in acknowledgement. With a flick of his finger, a beam of spiritual energy shot into the teleportation spirit array. The array burst into light, and the space around them began to violently distort. The vision before them blurred. Mu Chen knew the teleportation was about to begin. He gazed at the increasingly indistinct North Song Spiritual Academy and quietly whispered in his heart, "Everyone, take care. Until we meet again." Whoosh! The light of the teleportation spirit array reached its peak, and the space twisted into a vortex. With a surge of force, Mu Chen and the Nine Nether Sparrow transformed into streaks of light, rushing into the vortex and disappearing in the blink of an eye. The teleportation spirit array in the sky gradually faded, and the once violent fluctuations of space settled, returning to calm. The two figures were now completely gone. The North Song Spiritual Academy fell silent, the atmosphere heavy with a sense of melancholy. The Grand Song Academy headmaster watched this scene and could only smile helplessly. There had been many notable students who had left before, but never had their departure caused such a collective sense of loss throughout the entire academy. This kid, does he really have that much charm? The headmaster chuckled and shook his head, but didn't try to lift the mood. He knew that this sorrow would only fade with time. Perhaps, when the North Song Spiritual Academy produced another exceptionally talented student, the impact of Mu Chen's departure would lessen. But, at the thought of this, Headmaster Tai Tsong could only sigh in regret. However, amidst the sorrow, a trace of expectation also surged within his heart. He was eager to see how far the young man, who had once walked out of their Northern Song Spiritual Academy, could go in the future. Perhaps, as he had predicted, one day when that young man returned to the Northern Song Spiritual Academy, his power would shake the entire Great Thousand Worlds. Ling Shi stood silently atop the mountain, gazing at the spot where Mu Chen and the others had disappeared, her lips silent for a long time. Headmaster Tai Tsong and the others did not disturb her, quietly dispersing. Ling Shi stood there for an entire day. As the night gradually descended, she snapped out of her reverie. Looking down at the vast Northern Song Spiritual Academy below, the same familiar view seemed to lack something. giving her a sense of boredom, as though chewing on wax. She turned and returned to her courtyard, walking up to the closed bamboo house. Pushing the door open, she entered the tidy bamboo house. Hanging on the wall was a scroll painting, still the gentle, serene back view of the woman who always brought peace to her heart. Staring at the painting, Lingxi smiled softly and whispered, "Aunt Jing, Mu Chun has left. He's truly outstanding, just like your son. But I can no longer stay by his side. Aunt Jing, I will come find you. No matter who sealed my memories, I will never forgive them." Lingxi's delicate hand clenched slowly, her eyes radiating a cold, killing intent. "Aunt Jing, I will rescue you." She carefully folded the scroll and walked out of the bamboo house, gazing at the place she had lived for so long. "Sister Lingxi." Xun'er's timid voice came from the courtyard. She stood there, her eyes red from crying, and asked, "Are you leaving too?" Lingxi walked up and hugged Xun'er gently, smiling. "Yes, Sister Lingxi has things to do now. Xun'er, after I leave, don't neglect your cultivation. Otherwise, when I come back, I'll have to punish you." Xun'er hugged Lingxi tightly and nodded. "Sister Lingxi, will you and Brother Muchen come back someday?" Lingxi placed her snow-white chin gently on Xun'er's little head and whispered, "Don't worry. We will all come back." Xun'er obediently fell silent, curling up in Lingxi's embrace. The moonlight shone down, casting a soft glow on the beautiful woman's face, her delicate features glowing with the moon's light, creating the most breathtaking view in the Northern Song Spiritual Academy that night. And from that night onward, the students of Northern Song Spiritual Academy would realize that the stunning, captivating woman, who seemed so young yet held the position of an elder, Lingxi, had quietly left. She did not disturb anyone, and when she left, her back was still as enchanting as ever. This was a vast, endless ocean. The sea stretched far into the horizon, seemingly without end. Occasionally, large fish-shaped spirit beasts leaped from the water, causing towering waves. Sizzle. Above the ocean, the space suddenly warped, followed by violent spatial fluctuations. A vortex formed in the sky, and soon after, two figures shot out from the vortex and appeared above the ocean. Upon their appearance, they glanced at each other before looking around, momentarily stunned by the vastness of the ocean. "Where is this?" Mu Chen scratched his head, asking in confusion. Clearly, Nine Nether had more experience than Mu Chen. She leisurely took out a glowing scroll, unfurled it, and revealed a map filled with intricate patterns of light. It seemed to depict a massive, unexplainable area. She swept her gaze over the map, then pointed to a specific region with her slender finger. With a soft tap, the map rippled, and the area began to zoom in, becoming clearer. Finally, a pinpoint of light appeared on that region. "Here, we are here," Nine Nether smiled. "This is the ocean beyond Northern Song Continent. If we move forward, we'll enter Nanling Continent. There, we can use the teleportation spirit array to travel to other continents." Mu Chen stared at the map, astonishment in his eyes. He could feel that the map contained significant spiritual energy fluctuations. "Is this a spirit artifact?" This is a spirit map. It's used specifically for recording maps in the Great Thousand Worlds. Those who venture out for training usually prepare one. This particular one was what I prepared back then. Without such a spirit map, reaching Tianluo Continent wouldn't be an easy task, Nine Nether said with a slight nod. "With Nine Nether by my side, there's nothing to worry about." Mu Chun grinned, flattering her. These were his sincere words. If he were out here alone, he probably wouldn't even know what to do. How could he be as well prepared as Nine Nether, who had everything meticulously planned? Nine Nether shot him a glare, clearly unimpressed. "How much longer will it take to reach Tianluo Continent?" Mu Chun asked. "To reach Tianluo Continent, we will have to travel across dozens of continents, using the teleportation spirit arrays on each one. Even if we don't stop, it'll still take almost 2 months to get there," Nine Nether replied flatly. 2 months. Mu Chen's lips twitched involuntarily. "Plus, you won't have it easy during these 2 months, Nine Nether said, her expression becoming more serious as she looked at Mu Chun. "Mu Chun, you should know that you've left the Northern Heaven Spiritual Academy. Where we're going now is not an ivory tower. In this vast world, strength is paramount. If you don't have enough power, No one will take you seriously, no matter where you go. Even in the great Luo Heaven domain, where I reside, it's not a place of peace. The intrigues there are far more intense than the petty squabbles in Northern Heaven Spiritual Academy. Although I'll do my best to protect you, I know you, and I also know that you wouldn't want to be in such a situation. Mu Chen smiled faintly, his voice soft. Don't worry, I understood these principles a long time ago. The Great Luo Heaven Domain wouldn't be like Northern Heaven Spiritual Academy, where people would assist him in his cultivation. If he couldn't stand on his own, he'd likely be trampled underfoot by others. Nine Nether nodded lightly. You may have entered the Supreme stage, but you're still not even a first-grade Supreme. Is it because I haven't cultivated the Supreme Dharmakaya? Mu Chen said calmly. He was actually capable of cultivating the Supreme Dharmakaya now, but it would be quite ordinary compared to other Supreme bodies. Besides the Great Sun Indestructible Body, he didn't have any other method of cultivating a Supreme Dharmakaya. Moreover, he didn't want to waste precious Supreme Spiritual Liquid on such an ordinary Supreme Dharmakaya. He knew that once he gathered the remaining materials for the Great Sun Indestructible Body, he'd need a massive amount of Supreme Spiritual Liquid. If he was going to cultivate, he had no intention of following the conventional path. That's only one reason. Nine Nether nodded slightly and continued. The reason why Supreme Powerhouses are the watershed in cultivation isn't just the Supreme Sea and Supreme Dharmakaya. The most important factor is the spiritual energy of a Supreme Powerhouse. Their spiritual energy possesses a unique quality that far exceeds ordinary spiritual energy in terms of power. Spiritual quality? Mu Chen furrowed his brows. Many Supreme Powerhouses possess unique attributes in their spiritual energy. Some have cold, sinister spiritual energy, while others have violent and fiery spiritual energy. These qualities exist because their spiritual energy has a certain consciousness, which gives it extraordinary power. Mu Chen was thoughtful. He vaguely remembered the helper brought by Dragon Demon Palace, the Wu Liang ancestor. His spiritual energy was incredibly powerful, as when he attacked, a cold and dark sea of water surged forth. That water was actually his spiritual energy, domineering and far stronger than ordinary spiritual energy. How can I make my spiritual energy possess this quality? Mu Chen asked, pondering. Do you remember when your spiritual energy merged with my 9 nether flames? 9 nether asked. At that time, your spiritual energy was stronger than ordinary spiritual energy. In some sense, the two were connected, but it was just the difference between a small witch and a great witch. Mu Chen's eyes lit up in realization. The so-called spiritual quality, simply put, was about fusing other substances into one's own spiritual energy, causing it to undergo a transformation and become even more powerful. However, while it was easy to say, it was extremely difficult to do. Not all substances could be fused with one's spiritual energy. What kind of material should I fuse with? Mu Chen asked. Most Supreme Powerhouses choose to absorb energy from places of extreme cold or heat, or areas of extreme yin or yang. They use spiritual energy to fuse with these strange energies. This method is the simplest and easiest, but the improvement in spiritual power is limited. You've already fused with 9 nether flames, so your spiritual energy should be more attuned to fire-type materials. Also, since you've cultivated the Thunder God body, you should be more suited for thunder as well. 9 nether pondered for a moment. As for thunder-type materials, you currently don't have access to a sufficiently strong thunder source to fuse with. So, we'll put that aside for now. But as for flames, my undying fire should be a great choice. Mu Chen's eyes brightened. It wasn't just a great choice, it was perfect. He was no longer the novice he once was, and he clearly understood the power of the undying fire. The key thing about it was its profound characteristic, immortality. Of course, this didn't mean that possessing the undying fire would make him invincible to death, but because the undying fire had powerful healing abilities, it could gradually mend wounds as long as his divine soul wasn't immediately obliterated. Having the undying fire meant he'd gain an advantage in long battles as well. Mu Chen's eyes gleamed for a moment. Then he seemed to have thought of something. He looked at 9 nether and smiled wryly. But if I do that, won't it cause you some harm? Though 9 nether possessed the undying fire, it didn't come out of nowhere. It required a great deal of time and energy to cultivate, And if Mu Chen wanted his spiritual energy to fully evolve, he would need an enormous amount of undying fire. This would undoubtedly be a heavy burden on Nine Nether. Nine Nether didn't reply, her narrow eyes glancing at Mu Chen. It will be a bit troublesome, but it's not a big issue. But, from today onwards, travel by day, and at night, begin fusing with the undying fire. The bare minimum I expect is for you to complete your spiritual transformation before reaching Tianluo Continent. Nine Nether cut him off with an indifferent tone. If you can't do it, Nine Nether's lips curled into a dangerous smile. Then don't blame me for being ruthless. With a casual slap of her hand, the sea below cracked open, and a massive spirit beast that had just leaped out was instantly smacked to death. Mu Chen couldn't help but twitch at the corner of his mouth as he wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. He knew Nine Nether's personality well. If it came down to it, she'd really beat him up without hesitation, because this sister was just too violent. You have a problem with that? Nine Nether smiled sweetly at him, her beauty undeniable, but Mu Chen broke into a cold sweat and quickly shook his head. Good. Let's go. Nine Nether nodded in satisfaction. Fly over this sea. Mu Chen was stunned for a moment, then said, Why don't you transform into your true form and let me ride you? That would be so much faster. The moment the words left his mouth, he sensed something was wrong. Nine Nether's slender brows raised slightly, but she still smiled at him like a flower. Her smile even carried a hint of flirtation as she walked over. Her cheeks flushed and said, Mu Chen, little brother, do you really want to ride on your sister? Mu Chen forced a dry laugh and turned to flee. Bang! Just as he leaped into the air, a violent spiritual energy enveloped him. He looked up to see a massive hanging cloud wing crashing down, sending him flying with a resounding thud straight into the sea. Mu Chen surfaced from the water, and above him, a graceful figure soared by, followed by the sound of delicate laughter. Don't come out. Swim your way out of this sea. This is part of your training. Mu Chen gritted his teeth in frustration, muttering to himself that a true hero doesn't mind a little temporary loss. He would endure for now, but once his strength surpassed hers, he'd definitely pin her down and give her a good spanking. Nine Nether, you'd better watch out. The young man swam with all his might, growling inwardly as he cursed. Transforming one's spiritual energy is no simple feat, even for a supreme powerhouse. Although Mu Chen had previously merged the Nine Nether flames with his own spiritual energy, the difficulty of that process was like comparing a firefly to the full moon, a far cry from the challenge of his current spiritual metamorphosis. This time, he was not attempting to merge the Nine Nether flames, but something far more formidable, the Undying fire, which was countless times stronger than the Nine Nether flames. The cultivation method of Nine Nether was direct and domineering. There was no trickery involved. Instead, it boldly called upon the Undying fire, forcing it into Mu Chen's body. It sought out his supreme sea and plunged into it. The Undying fire roared within the supreme sea, and its intense heat nearly caused it to burn up. The overwhelming surge of spiritual energy was almost enough to make Mu Chen feel like he was being torn apart. The supreme sea itself seemed on the verge of shattering under the strain. Yet, whenever his endurance neared its breaking point, Nine Nether would withdraw the Undying fire entirely, allowing the spiritual energy within the supreme sea to calm before sending the fire back again. This cycle of boiling spiritual energy repeated itself, and the sensation Mu Chen experienced could only be described with 4 words: worse than death. According to Nine Nether, the Undying fire was far too domineering to be compared to the Nine Nether flames. If Mu Chen were to attempt a direct fusion with it, the only result would be the complete incineration of his spiritual energy and even the destruction of his supreme sea. Thus, if he wanted to merge with the Undying fire, he had no choice but to gradually allow his spiritual energy to adapt to it. How? By repeatedly enduring the burning heat of the Undying fire. As Nine Nether put it, it was like taking repeated blows. After enough of them, one would naturally become more resistant. As Mu Chen's spiritual energy was repeatedly roasted, it would eventually begin to adapt to the Undying fire, allowing him to proceed with the next step of the fusion. So, this excruciating training was the only path forward for Mu Chen. He had no choice but to endure. During the first 10 days of their journey, whenever night fell, Chen and Nine Nether would pause to rest. That was when Chen would face his nightly nightmare. However, despite the pain of this training, Chen gritted his teeth and persisted. He had long understood that power doesn't come without sacrifice. If he wanted to transform his spiritual energy, he had to pay the price. Moreover, he could sense that after each round of training, Nine Nether's face would turn slightly pale. After all, the undying fire was something she had painstakingly cultivated, and its constant consumption took a toll on her. Even though she had successfully evolved, the burden was still difficult for her to bear. If Chen were to admit that he couldn't continue, what kind of man would he be? Thus, the painful training continued. Despite the suffering, their journey did not slow down. In just half a month, they crossed vast continents. At first, the young man, newly arrived in the Great Thousand Worlds, was filled with wonder, but soon, he adapted. Eventually, most of his focus shifted to cultivation. In addition to traveling and training, Chen and Nine Nether would also make inquiries about the Void Solar Fruit and Undying Divine Leaf, two rare heavenly treasures. These were the final, essential materials Chen needed to complete his great son Undying body. However, all their efforts to gather information proved fruitless. The rarity of these two treasures was beyond Chen's imagination. After all, even supreme powerhouses were drawn to their allure. Especially the Void Solar Fruit. If obtained, it could be refined into the Supreme Sea, transforming into a blazing sun that would continuously shine on the spiritual energy within, infusing it with the power of the sun, making it incredibly domineering. What supreme powerhouse wouldn't regard such a treasure as a precious prize? As for the Undying Divine Leaf, it was equally rare. Legend had it that this treasure, also known as the Substitute Leaf, could save a person's life in the event of a calamity. Of course, the rumors were somewhat exaggerated. After all, if the attacks truly reached a certain terrifying level, even the immortal Divine Leaf would be completely destroyed. However, possessing such a treasure would undoubtedly offer perfect protection for oneself. And after learning about the rarity of these two heavenly spiritual treasures, Chen realized just how fortunate he was to have obtained the Nine Suns Spirit Fungus during the Spiritual Academy Grand Competition. After all, this treasure was no less remarkable than the first two. It seemed that gathering these two materials would indeed be a daunting task. The journey continued. In the blink of an eye, nearly a month had passed. Over the past month, Chen and the Nine Nether Sparrow had traveled across dozens of continents, and the vastness of the journey was beyond his imagination. Some of the continents they passed through were small in scale, even smaller than the North Song Continent, but there were also some that were exceptionally vast. While still not as grand as the Tianluo Continent, the forces there were far stronger than those on the North Song Continent. In just this short month, Chen's experiences had grown exponentially, and he had encountered various other races from the Great Thousand Worlds, broadening his horizons considerably. Of course, along with the increase in experience, Chen's cultivation had finally started to fall into a steady rhythm. After countless life-or-death trials, the spiritual energy in his supreme sea had gradually adapted to the undying fire. The pain he initially felt had significantly decreased. This slight adaptation allowed Chen to feel a sense of relief. His grueling cultivation over this period had finally begun to pay off. The full moon hung high in the sky, and on a mountaintop, Chen sat quietly, gazing into the distance. In the far-off horizon, he could see a grand city, its bright lights shining like daylight. This city, known as Blazing Flame City, was located on the Blazing Flame Continent, a land mostly dominated by deserts. The spiritual energy in this land was hotter and more intense than elsewhere. Inside the city, there was a teleportation spirit array leading to the next continent. However, Chen and the Nine Nether Sparrow had chosen not to enter the city, opting instead to remain outside. Tonight, Chen's cultivation was crucial. He began to sense that the spiritual energy within his supreme sea was subtly changing. There was an indescribable sensation, but it was extremely important. Chen took a deep breath, his eyes shining with determination. He knew his spiritual energy had reached a critical point. Turning to the Nine Nether Sparrow by the campfire, he softly spoke, "I'm planning to merge with the undying fire tonight." The Nine Nether Sparrow, who had been tending to the fire, froze. She raised her head, her bright eyes wide with surprise. After a moment, she frowned and said, "It's only been a month. Isn't that a bit too soon?" She had originally planned to give Mu Chen 2 months to complete his spiritual energy cultivation, but now he was compressing that time frame by half. Merging spiritual energy with the undying fire was dangerous. If the energies went out of control, neither of them would be able to manage it. "It's not about urgency. I truly feel it's the right time," Mu Chen replied with a faint smile. The strange sensation he felt could not be ignored. If he missed it now, he didn't know when it would appear again, so he didn't want to let it slip away. The 9 nether sparrow studied Mu Chen. His gaze was serious, and it was clear he was not joking. After a moment of silence, she nodded lightly. "All right. Thank you." Mu Chen smiled gratefully before gradually closing his eyes. With a thought, he entered his Supreme Sea. At this moment, the vast spiritual energy within the Supreme Sea was surging like an ocean. But now, the spiritual energy in his Supreme Sea felt slightly different from a month ago. It now seemed to contain a hint of purple hue. This was due to the undying fire's constant tempering over the past month. Suddenly, a crisp sound of water splashing echoed across the surface of the Supreme Sea. A shadow appeared, slowly rising to the surface. The figure mirrored Mu Chen exactly. It was his divine soul. After the Supreme Sea was successfully condensed, Mu Chen's divine soul had hidden within it. On that mountain peak, the 9 nether sparrow had already seated herself in front of Mu Chen. Her delicate face was serious, reflecting the weight of a month's enduring torment. All for this seemingly simple step. She also gently exhaled a fragrant mist, then extended her long, jade-like fingers and lightly touched the center of Mu Chen's forehead. Purple flames suddenly surged from the tip of the 9 nether sparrow's finger, transforming into slender columns of fire that violently rushed into Mu Chen's body. As the purple flames surged in, Mu Chen's body shuddered violently. He gritted his teeth, making not a single sound. Within the Supreme Sea, Mu Chen's divine soul lifted its gaze. His eyes were filled with gravity, for they had begun to shimmer with a vivid purple hue. This wasn't because of him. Instead, it was because, high above the Supreme Sea, a vast, oppressive sea of purple flames was sweeping across the sky with terrifying force. This time, the undying fire began to reveal its true ferocity.